Hi, I've decided to do a video on doing a deep dive on the heat of chilies and what causes the heat of chilies to vary, what are the genetics behind it, what are the environmental factors, because chili heat is one of the main questions we get asked, unsurprisingly, at the chili farm, what causes it, that sort of thing. And I've actually written quite a detailed blog, including all the academic references and all the research references that I've used to pull this information together. So I'll put a link of that um, in the description of the video down below. So you can click on that, go and read the blog if you like. You can even just go and look at the research yourself, go and read the papers. Some of them are quite academic and dry to read. Unless you're really into chilies, then you'd find it really interesting. But I've tried to summarize it all into the blog, so it makes it really nice and easy for anybody to sort of pick up and read and get a good understanding of where chili heat comes from. Why are some chilies hot? And why do we perceive the heat? So there's a gene in humans called I think it's called a TRPV1 gene, and that gene controls a human's ability to perceive heat and perceive the stimuli of capsaicin in the mouth causing heat. So capsaicin is one of the most popular compounds of the capsaicinoid group of compounds that control heat in chilies, and I believe it's unique to the capsicum genus. So really interestingly, you've got other the capsicum genus belongs to Solanaceae family. You've got other vegetables within that family. You've got tomatoes, aubergines, and but chilies are the only ones that produce heat. And it's because of that heat and that pungency which have made chilies globally famous over hundreds and thousands of years. So I'm going to do a deep dive into what causes that. Now, two of the main questions we get at the chili farm revolves around the chili heat. One is, um, if somebody's growing a hot chili, they quite often get in touch and say, "Well, I've been growing this chilies for many years, this Carolina Reaper or Scorpion or a Scotch bonnet or something, and it's always been hot. And this year I'm growing it, and it's not as hot as in previous years." So that's one question. And the sort of inverse of that, we always get asked, I'm growing uh, Pimento de Padrons or Trinidad Pimentos this year, and they're not as hot as they're not as mild as they used to be. And suddenly, instead of getting one out of a dozen or so, almost all of them are hot. And they ask, why is that? And that's down to really, really interesting and complex interactions of the genetics of the chili and its ability to produce capsaicinoid compounds and the actual growing conditions, the environmental conditions. And not to give away too much, but you'd be quite surprised to find out how strong environmental controls are on the chili's ability to produce heat. So we're going to go and do a deep dive into all of that. There is a myth that the heat of a chili is sometimes influenced by the quality of the seeds. There's actually two myths, one to do with the isolation of plants and one to do with the actual quality of the seeds themselves. So, first of all, there is no scientific evidence to suggest that the quality of the seeds, as in if the seedlings germinate or not, or if the seeds come from poor quality fruits, that actually influences the heat of the chili that is a result of growing a plant from those seeds. There's no scientific evidence for that. What there is some scientific evidence for is the influence of sort of seeds collected from plants over successive generations. Now, on this point about the collection process and the plants from which it's collected, it typically boils down to issues related to the quality of the progeny. So let's say the heritage and the breeding year on year from different parent groups that leads to chili heat being different from what you'd expect. Now, there is sort of quantitative genetic inheritance. What that means is that there's a tendency for hotter chilies to sometimes get hotter if over successive generations when those seeds are collected and then grown again. And similarly, there is a tendency if the lineage is leading to a milder chili, that over time it could get milder. So that's quantitative genetic inheritance. That influences the long-term sort of uh, phenotypical results of successive generations. Now, that's different from sort of poor isolation of plants and the isolation of plants in general for seed collecting. Now, sometimes there's a tendency for people to describe the heat of a chili being influenced by the fact that the seeds have not been collected from isolated plants. And whilst that's technically true, I think it's quite unlikely in most cases that a chili heat is not the expected heat that you'd expect from it because of the seeds having been collected from poor quality plants. Now, I'm just walking into the our tunnel 8, which contains all our Carolina Reaper plants and our Butcholokia plants. So you can see behind me there's actually probably close to 1,000 plants in this tunnel, about 500, roughly 500 of Reaper and 500 Butcholokias. It is true, if you were to sort of cross-pollinate, I'll use the example of a Scotch bonnet versus a Carolina Reaper, because everybody knows the heat level of Scotch bonnet, probably 250,000 Scoville heat units, and a Carolina Reaper well above 1,000,000. Now, if you grow a Carolina Reaper and it's not as hot as you'd expect it to be, and on the palate, you taste it and it turns out to be more like 500 Scoville heat units, and you say, this is not as hot as I was expecting, so this seed must have been collected from a fruit which has been grown from a plant from poor isolation, as in it's been cross-pollinated with something else. And for this argument, let's say it's cross-pollinated with a Scotch bonnet. Now, chili plants are really good at self-pollination. The flower structure means that the pollen from the anther and the male sexual organs can easily get transmitted from that location to the stigma, which is the top of the female reproductive part of the flower before it goes down to the ovary. And that is less than a millimeter away. So the likelihood is quite high that a flower will be self-pollinated much more readily than be cross-pollinated from pollen from another flower. I'm not saying that's impossible. It's statistically quite unlikely that it will be pollinated by from pollen from another flower. Yes, an insect can bring pollen from another flower to that flower, but because the flower itself is producing its own pollen, it's quite likely that it's self-pollinated. So and if that's the case, and you're collecting over multiple generations, yes, because of that quantitative inheritance, there's a chance that you can eventually breed a Carolina Reaper that is not as hot as you'd expect it to be, or you'd breed a Scotch bonnet that's hotter than you'd expect it to be, or vice versa. But on the point of the isolation of the plants, that is where it gets even less likely, in my opinion. So if you were to unintentionally cross, you're planning to collect Carolina Reaper seeds, for example, and you unintentionally collected seeds from flowers that were unintentionally cross-pollinated with pollen from a Scotch bonnet. So that means that that fruit that's developed and the seeds within that will have 50% of genetics, 50%, sorry, of the genetics of the Carolina Reaper and 50% of the genetics of the Scotch bonnet. Now, the seeds that you then collect from that hybrid cross that's happened unintentionally, the seeds will then have 50% of both parents. You then grow those seeds on, and the resulting first generation will be hugely different from either individual parents, as in the phenotypical fruit that results. It's quite unlikely that you'll end up with a fruit that is identical in every form, plant and fruit, identical in every form to a Carolina Reaper, because you're intending to get a Carolina Reaper from this. That the resulting plant and the fruits will be identical in every aspect of the phenotypical expression of the genes that are inherent to growing this plant. Everything will be identical to what you'd expect to a Carolina Reaper, except that the heat is different. And then you would have to then, out of that first generation, and there'll be 50% random genes selected for each plant when that seed was developing, you'll then have to sort of have all the plants be almost identical to what you would expect it to be, but that's not the case because it's the first generation, so you'll have lots of variations. And then across all of those plants, you then collect those seeds and then sow them, and you'll end up with, or you're hoping to end up with, more Carolina Reaper plants and fruits that end up being milder because of that argument of it being cross-pollinated and inheriting those genes from the Scotch bonnet, which means that it's milder now in all aspects of the flavor of the fruit, except that the fruit looks identical to a Reaper. I think that's quite unlikely. So I just wanted to put that part aside, because the isolation of plants is a contentious topic, and some people isolate their plants, some people don't. I don't want to get into that argument, but the likelihood of a non-isolated plant leading to a fruit which is identical in every aspect to what you'd expect, apart from the heat, which has led to that fruit being not as hot as you expect it to be, or hotter than you'd expect it to be, depending on what what you were expecting from the fruit that you're collecting. I think that's quite unlikely. So that's the myths around sort of seed collecting and that part of it aside. There's way more interesting things going on behind the scenes when it comes to the genetics of the fruits themselves, control and how that controls the heat, how the capsaicinoids are actually produced, and the sort of the chemical and biosynthesis process that's happening, as well as the environmental factors leading to the heat of the fruit. So we'll dive a little bit into those topics now. So capsaicin is one of the capsaicinoid molecules that's produced by a chili, and it starts being produced or synthesized by within the fruit from about 20 days after the flower opens. Now the it starts to accumulate in the what's called the epidermal cells, and these are the cells which are near the very surface of the plant tissue, and particularly along the placental mass. So that's the white pithy parts that the seeds are attached to that then eventually sort of transitions into the main flesh of the chili. When you cut open a super hot chili, for example, you see droplets of these of the capsaicinoid molecules. It seems like an oily, often a yellowy, oily consistency and texture, and they when they start to accumulate, they accumulate in these blisters, and these blisters are very thin walled because it's in the epidermal cells of the plant, and they can easily be broken. So sometimes when you cut open, you might see the droplets start to run down the insides, and that is because it's simply just broken just from pure agitation of the fruit itself. It just sort of the blisters pop open. So let's talk about the genetics now and how that influences the plant's ability to produce capsaicinoids within the fruit. The capsicum genus has had its genome mapped fully, so scientists now have a good understanding of the structure of the genome and various genes that control various things about the fruit, its ability to produce carotenoids and capsaicinoids and stuff like that. And what they found was there's a gene called the PUN1 gene, and that gene is almost directly responsible for the production of what's called capsaicinoid synthase. And that is an enzyme which is the precursor to the final production of capsaicinoid molecule, the final molecule itself of capsaicin and capsaicinoids in general. And that PUN1 gene is either directly responsible for the capsaicinoid synthase production, or it's more of a regulatory gene further up that biosequence that happens within the fruit. So it actually might be a gene that controls sort of on off the fruit's ability to start to produce it or not. So that gene has been mapped. There's also another gene which is called loss of vesicle, and that gene has been shown to be responsible for the fruit's ability to have those vesicles along the placental walls where the capsaicinoid molecules finally get stored. So together, those two genes control the plant's ability to produce and store the capsaicinoids within the plant tissue, particularly within the placental wall. Now, those genes and the fruit's ability to contain those genes, the plant's ability to have those genes, for example, is controlled by basic Mendelian genetics and inheritance. And it's sort of stuff that you learn in high school in terms of peas and human eye color, whether or not it's dominant, recessive, and basic genetics like that. Those genes, the plant's ability to have or not have those genes is controlled by Mendelian style genetics. There's also evidence to suggest that there's quantitative genetic inheritance involved. So those characteristics whereby over successive generations, the ability of a fruit to produce more of a particular characteristic, which is in this case capsaicinoids, seems to be quantitatively controlled over successive generations. So all of this gets quite complicated. So there's three takeaways I take away from this is that Firstly, yes, there's genes that control the fruit's ability to produce capsaicinoid compounds, and those genes control the plants to have the ability to produce them or not. So without those genes, they can't do it. Once those genes are then in place, so within the genetic lines, you have a plant that's got those genes, then it's down to quantitative inheritance over successive generations as to if that lineage will be hotter or milder. And then finally, once both of those things are in place, then it's finally down to the environmental factors which influence the plant's final ability and how many or how much capsaicinoid it actually produces. So, as I mentioned before in the video, the environmental factors is quite significant. So we're going to talk about that next. So now that we understand the genetics a little bit, let's talk about the environmental controls. And this is perhaps the most important for everybody watching this video because it's what you can actually sort of influence to some degree. So it turns out that the environmental factors have a quite a significant role to play in the heat of a chili and how much capsaicinoids it actually produces. So I'm currently standing in our nursery tunnel, and behind me we've got some Trinidad pimentos sitting in some 30-litre pots. And these were some specimen plants that we were just doing some experiments on here in the nursery. And they provide a good example, so I'll get onto those in a second. So the environmental factors, such as what watering and sunlight and heat, they affect the plants because they produce stress onto the plant. And if a plant is stressed, it tends to produce more capsaicinoids. So for example, studies have shown that elevated nighttime temperatures can lead to hotter fruits, and also lack of watering. So if a plant dries out and is stressed as a result of that, it will tend to produce hotter fruits. Typically in your greenhouse at home or your windowsill, your conservatory, or wherever you're growing your chilies, there is going to be fluctuations in temperature. There's very little you can do about it unless you have really expensive kit to sort of maintain temperatures in the greenhouse and stuff like that. So what can you do to maintain constant environment? So try and position your plant somewhere where it'll receive the most constant amount of sunlight, and make sure you open your vents in your greenhouse and close your vents at night. Now, in the UK, for example, we have quite varied summers, and the weather can tend to be quite variable, and there's very little you can do about that. So that will cause your plant to produce fruits of differing heat levels across the fruits within an individual plant from branch to branch, but also across several of those plants if you have multiple of the same variety growing in different pots. And there's very little you can do to sort of change that, but you can, I guess, be aware of what causes the chilies of those plants to be different heat levels. Now, if you were to grow a Carolina Reaper, or let's say a Carolina Reaper, several Carolina Reaper plants, the average person who can handle average heat level chilies, so Thai chilies and Scotch bonnets and stuff like that, and can't handle super hot Carolina Reapers, you will not be able to tell the difference. I'd go as far to say you will not be able to tell the difference from one Carolina Reaper on one branch versus another Reaper on another branch, or much less another Reaper on another plant sitting somewhere else in your growing setup. Because the fruits are so hot, for you to be able to tell the difference in those heat levels of those fruits, I think it's very unlikely, unless you're really, really into super hots. But if, for example, you're growing a Padron pepper, Pimento de Padron, or a Trinidad pimento, then it'll be quite easy to recognize that, because those are fruits that are supposed to be mild. Now, those are fruits that actually have the genes within them. So they have the ability to produce capsaicinoids. And it's quite often down to the environmental conditions, which mean that the fruits are milder than they would otherwise if they were stressed. So we used to produce quite a lot of Trinidad sort of Pimento de Padron peppers, and we stopped doing it and selling it as a fresh chili because we can't compete with the supermarkets. Now, the supermarkets are importing theirs from places like Spain and other places across Europe and around the world where they have much more industrial scale farming, and they can have temperature controlled environments, huge glass houses. And even if they were to not have those temperature controlled environments, generally their summers there are more stable than it is here in the UK, which means that the likelihood of them producing a fruit which is hotter than it should be is much lower. So if you were to go to Trinidad, for example, and you buy some Trinidad pimentos, most, if not all of them, are generally heatless. They're very, very, very mild. And that's because, you're growing in a tropical climate. The average temperature is 30 degrees or so, and that never changes throughout the year. So it there's very little stress on the plant from that point of view. Whereas in our crop tunnels, what we found is quite often we would get pimento with the Padron peppers that are hotter than you'd get in the supermarket, and there'll be more of them within the punnet that's hotter than not. Whereas you'd find one out of a dozen, or say, Russian roulette style, you'd get more than that from ours. So we stopped growing it because people were saying that our Padron peppers are just too hot, and it's something that we can't control because our polytunnels will get hotter at times, and sometimes the ground will get drier, so the plant is actually stressed. So on that point, behind me, you can see here we've got some Trinidad pimento looking really, really good. Lots of them, lots of healthy fruit, heavily laden plants, and you would be tempted to think these are nice and heatless. Turns out these are quite hot, and we're not going to collect seeds from them, but these were grown to sort of experiment with having these plants in pots. And although these plants were grown from seeds collected from heatless plants grown in the crop tunnels from previous years, the simple fact of these being in pots, and to be quite honest, we're not very good with the watering of the plant pots in the nursery sometimes when it gets really dry. The plants have, over time, dried out and become stressed. The fruits on these plants are much hotter. So if I was to pick one of these and bite into them, they'll be much hotter than you'd expect. But there's nothing wrong with the actual genetics of these plants, because the ones that were growing out in the crop tunnels are actually heatless, as they should be. So it just goes to show that the environmental conditions are quite important. And one final point about that, there was a study done by the famous Paul Bosland and his team from the New Mexico State University Chili Pepper Institute. And what they found was, as part of this experiment that they did, was that plants, within the study that they did, they demonstrated that the environmental control factors had a stronger influence on the amount of capsaicinoids being produced than the genetics. So what that means was that the variability that they were finding in the results were on heat level were much wider than the average heat rating of the type of variety that they were growing. And that was purely down to environmental conditions, stresses such as light and heat and water and stuff. So advice for you guys would be to just sort of look after your plants as best you can. Don't overwater them. Don't underwater them. Keep them as consistent as possible, especially under watering, because there's very little you can do on the light and the heat. And if you're growing in a greenhouse, position it somewhere as stable as possible. And on a windowsill, just try your best. But I hope that explains to you guys why chilies can be hotter or milder than you'd expect. It was certainly interesting for us here at the Chili Farm to find some hard information and finally put pen to paper and document it all. So we've got the thorough answers for you now when you ask us why my chilies might be hotter or milder than they should be. So yeah, hope that was interesting, and catch you on the next video.